Welcome to Pathways to Recovery. My name is Joshua Pear, and today we have Mr. Brezz Hall. He is the founder of Fourth Dimension Apparel. He's been through recovery, and he's willing to share his story today. So, Mr. Brezz Hall, man, thank you so much for coming on. One of the things that you said was addiction has put you on your current path and has given you purpose. In order for you to receive those gifts, you had to accept that addiction had become a problem and commit to healing. So my question is, can you walk us through those early years and how addiction first entered your life?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it. So, my story really starts as a child. I grew up I had a traumatic upbringing, right? So, my father was an alcoholic, and there was a lot of physical and emotional abuse in the home. Around 13 is when started drinking alcohol. Once I started drinking alcohol, smoking weed came my release, right? Or my escape, rather. You know, my father passed away at the age of 14. He was an alcoholic, but um, he had tried heroin at that time, and he ended up overdosing. And then once that happened, my mother kind of did her own form of escape, right? So she started going out all the time and kind of leaving me at home with my younger brother. Without my father being that authoritative figure in my life, I just kind of things started to escalate quickly. That kind of accelerated over the years. It took 30 years before I got to a place of complete desperation, you know?
What were some of the main substances that you used? How did it evolve over time?
So, people ask me a lot, what was your drug of choice? I don't know if I could identify a drug of choice, right? It all depended on accessibility. It was never, sure, I enjoyed the highs, right? But it was never really about that. I could say that in hindsight. It was alcohol and marijuana for pretty much all the way through high school. Around 19 years old, I ended up trying cocaine. Cocaine at that point was still just kind of like, okay, it's the weekend, we're going out to the club or whatever, to the bar, to a party, we would get cocaine. And then, this was late 90s, early 2000s. So right around that time, ecstasy or MDMA became like a really big thing, at least in my area. And then once I tried that, that became like, it wasn't a drug where you could do that every day because if you do it, too close together, you won't feel the effects. But I would do that as often as possible, right? And then it led into, opioids, Percocets, and things like that. But throughout the past 30 years, I kind of dabbled in everything. I had an extended period of time where I was smoking PCP, and then, uh, eventually in the later years, right before I got clean, I would say the last 4 years, I had switched from cocaine to crystal meth. The crystal meth was cheaper, much more affordable, and it was much more accessible because the cocaine was like pretty much not cocaine anymore. Like you were pretty much wasting your money at this point.
No, I remember the first time I tried methamphetamines. I was like, I've been wasting all my time and money.
Yeah. And in the early stages, I was like, oh boy, was that a mistake, right?
Yeah.
Because things went south really fast with that. The depression got extremely bad. The tolerance was crazy. I remember I would get a quarter gram and it would last me for, you know, days, pretty much throughout the week. And by the last couple days, of my using, or the last 6 months of my using, I was buying an 8 ball and it'd be gone in a day. But, I'm thankful that I did make that choice because it took something of that magnitude to push me to seek help, you know.
You said previously that addiction robbed you of your happiness and it strained relationships. Can you expand on that, paint that picture for us?
Yeah, for sure. My daughter is an adult. Um, I have grandchildren now at this point. When she was growing up, my idea or my concept of like fatherhood and like raising a child was much different than it is today, you know? And it had a lot to do with my upbringing. You know, my father had taught me what all of these things that represent respect, right? So my father was big on what he called respect. I now can see that that was like a distorted understanding of respect. And that put a huge strain on me and my daughter's relationship. Things have gotten better, but it's very hard for me not to look back and say, I wish I had done things differently. You know, and then my wife, obviously we had many fallen outs and things over my using, and my mother, my younger brother, like it pretty much touches every aspect of your life and every relationship you're involved in. Me and my mother's relationship was fantastic because she was such a caring, loving individual, but I certainly made that difficult for her, you know. And my younger brother did some time. He was incarcerated for several years, and my ego and my pride to say I told you so caused me to like not support him through that incarceration. So these are all things that I look back on, and I try not to have regrets in life, but you know, if you have a magic wand, maybe you would do some things differently.
What were some of those early signs, those red flags that you can recognize now in hindsight?
Man, they're endless. And what's wild is they weren't, I just could not see them at the time. People would point them out to me and I would still not see them. But you know, from the very first time I started drinking, right? I remember I was 13 years old and I had a buddy, and his mom would go to the liquor store for us on the weekends, right? Friday night, Saturday night. And, you know, she would buy us some beer and we would drink the beer. My buddy would like tap out, you know, he starts not feeling well or whatever. And I just didn't have that in me, right? I just wanted to keep going. And then, you know, I remember pestering him throughout the week, you know, like, hey man, try to get your mom to go to the store for us, get your mom to go to the store for us. And he just thought that was absurd, right? He's like, we have school. It's just not, where is this coming from? So, you know, that would probably be the earliest memory of me thinking back. There were many red flags at that point. But again, you just choose not to see them. But, you know, I've gotten in car accidents with my daughter in the car, and um, drinking and driving was a big thing for me. You know, like we would go out and my wife doesn't really drink. She's never been a drinker. She would want to drive home, and I just flat out would refuse to let her drive, and it would cause conflict. And it's like all of these are red flags to dangerous behavior, you know?
At your lowest point, what impact did that have on your view of yourself?
Man, honestly, I've always kind of struggled with that, you know, from the trauma of my past, and the upbringing with my father, and kind of it was all disciplinary, you know, nothing was good enough, nothing was satisfactory to him, you know. It it was kind of ingrained in me, and I still struggle with that today. Towards the end, things just got really dark, man. I was confined to my bedroom. I wasn't able to leave bed, and this is with drugs and alcohol. Like there were many years where if I didn't have drugs and alcohol, I would just sleep all day, you know? But it got to the point where I was still getting high and drinking, and the depression was still so bad, you know? The feeling of wanting to escape was no more satisfied through the drugs and alcohol. So, you know, I wish even that was enough for me to say I have a problem with drugs and alcohol, but that's kind of not how it worked out with my story. I kind of had to gradually come to that conclusion through treatment.
Were there moments that you tried to stop but couldn't, and what got in the way?
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know if there was sincere efforts to stop, you know, as far as like no more. It was kind of like slow down, modify, you know, adjust, but it was never really like I'm not doing this anymore. That thought never really crossed my mind. And that's wild for me to think about. But, it would be okay. Well, I'm only going to drink beer, no liquor. I'm only going to get high on the weekends. I'm only going to buy 5 pills, those type of things.
What was that breaking point that finally opened that door to change? You said treatment?
Yeah. Well, so my recovery date is February 2021. From 2020, no, from 2019 to 2021, the beginning of 21, I was in and out of like mental health facilities, and I was struggling with my mental health all around. I am dual diagnosis, like I do have bipolar as well. So, you know, it was easy for me to blame everything on that, right? And like, even though everyone in my life is telling me the drugs and alcohol are not helping, when you're in it, it kind of, they seem to be the solution. And now today, I would say they even were the solution for a long time until
Yeah,
they stopped working.
they're a solution and they work, but it comes with its drawbacks.
Well, they work for a while, right? I mean, they work for a long time. I got by for 30 years, and um, I had the same job for 20 years. I worked in a warehouse from '02 to 22 when I was already in recovery, and I decided to get into the mental health and addiction field. And that kind of fed into my ego of like, well, I'm not an addict. I'm not an alcoholic, right? I'm not living under a bridge, drinking out of a bag. Like, that's not me. So, as far as like, I was in and out of mental health facilities from 19 to 21. The last time in the beginning of 21, I go into this one of the same facilities I've been into hundreds of times, right? And the depression was so bad. I remember I was sitting there like with my hands, face in my hands, and I was sitting in a corner, and I sat there for hours and hours. And one of the techs came up to me, and man, I was trying to identify this, but she didn't really say anything magical, right? She just engaged with me. She took me into a private office and we talked, and a light switch came on, right? It's like, I've done this over and over. I'm going to go home and I'm going to repeat this cycle. Like, something has to change. Um, that was when I just got honest, man. And what's crazy is I wasn't honest just with her. It was one of the first times I got honest with myself, you know? I told her, like, I definitely have a problem with drugs, you know? And at that time, I was still convinced drinking wasn't a problem. Um, you know, in society today, particularly in America, like all over the world, I'm sure, drinking is an acceptable thing, So I told her this. She asked me if I wanted to go into treatment. Even at that point, I wasn't ready to commit to like a 30-day program. You have every kind of excuse you can come up with, which at the time you don't think of it as excuses. Telling her, well, my wife is sick. So my wife has lupus. She's had it since she was a child. She's had 3 kidney transplants. And that was a way for me to say, like, I can't go away, right? I even said, like, my job, like, I have a job and I can't miss work. The ironic part to that was I had FMLA for my mental health, right? Those last couple years, I was not going to work. I promise you, I was going to work maybe 2 days a week, you know, burning through my PTO like as soon as I get it. And even when that was gone, I still wasn't going. So anyway, I spoke to my wife, and somehow, what I believe was a God moment. It didn't come from me, but I told her, like, okay, I'll go into treatment. And in the 30-day program, I kind of was forced into the 12-step program. Um, the again, more God moments. I'm really good at recognizing these in hindsight. Still today struggle seeing them in real time. But I did what was called a bed to bed. The rehab had sent a vehicle down to pick me up, and the rehab facility was in northern Pennsylvania, like up by New York, by like Syracuse. And it's a 5-hour trip. So they had somebody drive 5 hours down to pick me up. As soon as I get in the car, the guy says, well, we have to go to Baltimore to pick up somebody else who is also getting it into the program. So we drive down, we pick this guy up from the VA hospital in Baltimore. His name was Tim. As soon as we pick Tim up, me and Tim start connecting, in the back of his car, and Tim is sharing some of his story with me. And he was a Desert Storm vet, and he had many, many years of recovery under his belt at one point, but he had relapsed, and he had ended up at the VA and found out that he had like end stage cirrhosis of the liver. So this was like he had no choice. He felt he had to like make this work. So anyhow, right there, the 12 steps were kind of introduced to me because he was a big AA guy, and we pretty much talked um 12 steps for that 5 hour ride. He spoke a little bit about his time in the military, and, we shared a little bit of traumas and things, but a lot of it revolved around the 12 steps. And at this time, I still wasn't open to that idea. You know, I've always struggled with the God thing because for me, it was always the thought of like, there can't be a God because there's so much bad in the world. My life has been so rough. It's that victim mentality of like me, 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 me. If there is a God, he doesn't like me, you know? So in return, I don't like him. I don't want anything to do with this, right? But then when we get to the facility, they have a policy. We only get one 15-minute phone call a month. I mean, a week, pardon me. One 15-minute phone call a week to our family on Saturday. And in order to make that phone call, you had to attend morning meditation and the 12-step group every day of the week leading up to Saturday. Me and my wife have been together since I was young. We got together when I was like 19, right? I was kind of very codependent. I worked and I made income, but my wife was on disability. She did all the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, all of this stuff. And I just felt like I couldn't survive without her. So that in turn made me attend those meetings, you know? That combined with the state of desperation that I was in and the feeling of like something has to change, I was honest with them about what I seen as barriers, which mainly was the God thing. They gave me a copy of the big book and they told me to read the chapter, We the Agnostics. And when I read that chapter, I became more open. My walls slowly started coming down. I was reading a lot of books, and when I was in the rehab, when I was in the mental health facility, I was reading books. I had all of the books that I was reading at that time, which were like, nonfiction, like mob books, drug dealer books, and like all of this stuff. Once they gave me that book and I read that chapter, all I read was that. Uh, So the 12 steps kind of grew from this 1 hour meeting every night to like, that's all I'm talking about with these guys in there. Uh, Another like God intervention for me was a lot of the people in that facility were very familiar with the 12 steps, you know? And an older me would say, well, this is proof that 12 steps don't work, right? Because they're all in a rehab with me. And if they're such experts on this program that is like saves your life, it's just proof that it doesn't work. But I was so open and I was in such a state of desperation that I was like, a lot of these guys had 10, 12, 15 years recovery at some point in their life. And sure, they made a mistake and they were back where I am, but they had achieved something that I never had achieved.
You
So,
called it the gift of desperation. What do you mean by that?
yeah, absolutely, man. I was not going to make a change. I struggle with the term rock bottom, right? Because I can think of many times in my life where I was like, this is my rock bottom. But did I do anything? I tried to do things about it, but did I fully commit? Did I tear down those walls and become open to doing whatever it is, even if it made me uncomfortable, like believing in a higher power. I was not ready to do that until the desperation was so great, and that's why I refer to it as a gift, because it made me be open to suggestion. And that's what I owe my recovery to.
Man, I totally feel that. There's same kind of thing. I went through a program and we had to do morning devotions. I ran across a scripture that talks about the God of comfort, and what it pretty much boils down to is we had to come to a place of death, pretty much by our own doing. We wanted to be in charge. We wanted to be in control, and it led us to a place of like where we're begging for death. And that had to happen. It says this had to happen so that we learn to rely on the God of comfort. And man, being at that point and then reading something like that, I can definitely understand how you describe desperation as a gift, because we had to realize what our and you hear it all the time. My best thinking got me here today. What recovery tools help you practically, emotionally on a day to day?
So, obviously we spoke about the 12 steps, and I'm um, still actively involved in the fellowship. I still engage with my sponsor. I still go to my home group. I still do service work. I admittedly am not very good at the sponsorship thing. And that has a lot to do with my self-worth, you know, that type of thing. Um, and that's something that I continually work on. Um, but I've been at this about it. Actually, today is 4 years and 5 months, right? So I have a long journey ahead of me. But outside of that, man, I there are many other things that I do that help me in my recovery without the goal being to help me in my recovery. I mentioned that I change fields, right? So right now I am a certified uh, certified peer recovery specialist. So I work in a prison in a recovery program. I try to share insight on things that have helped me make a change in my life. And the way that helps me in my recovery is it keeps that pain fresh in my mind. I will forget really quickly why it is I'm in recovery. I don't have as many of those moments where life gets hard and it's like I want to escape through drinking and using. But I know that if I forget that pain, those thoughts will return. I've been doing things like this with the podcast and trying to just spread the message of hope and recovery. So, I do those things. I started Fourth Dimension Apparel, which you mentioned in the beginning, with the sole intention of spreading a message. I invested in some printing equipment and I do all of the design work and printing out of this small room that we're in now. Um, and each design is just created to get someone's attention and have them ask, like, hey, man, what is that all about? Because a big thing for me is, I used to say like raise awareness, and awareness is super important, but I feel like awareness is much more widespread now. Everybody understands that addiction is a problem in our society, but the stigma is still there, right? So this provides us an opportunity to educate people and open up that line of communication where we can talk about why I am not a bad person, right? I just have an illness that you don't understand is an illness. I have an allergy, right? So yeah, man, my day-to-day life is consumed with recovery. Things I do for fun, things I do for work, things I do for side money, things I do to give back, all consume my life. And I honestly feel like I can't change that. You know, this has gotten me farther than I've ever gotten. And I have to stick and stick.
You're a really cool guy, man. I would have loved to have you as a sponsor or as a coach when I was going through my stuff. So keep doing what you're doing. What truth are you most proud of to own today?
What truth? I think like me being able to see true truth is, I'm just so grateful for that, right? Because a lot of truth, this is going to sound funny, but this is just how I feel, right? Like a lot of truth is subjective because lots of truth changes. You know, something that's true today, the sun revolves around the earth, or, you know, we could go through all of this, right? Isn't necessarily true tomorrow. But through my spirituality and I feel that I know objective truth. I know I can feel now what is good and what is bad without having to manipulate myself into believing the the opposite, you know? I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's something that I think is so important in my life is being able to differentiate real truth and just, you know.
It really does. You kind of mentioned something at the beginning, how your father taught you what respect meant. Man, that just resonates with me. It really does. You get set on a course, and the first thing that went through my mind, of course, the counselor side is irrational core beliefs, but not just as personally, the same kind of messages and lessons that were taught. And then looking at how I took those lessons, ran with them, and how it influenced all my relations, all my decisions, and not for the better. And so, what was true then, looking at it today, that is not respect. Is actually, if anything, it's not you protecting your own self respect. It is disrespecting yourself in the way that you react. And so, yeah, that's been a lot of self work just in that itself of working through those old truths and redefining what those concepts really mean, whether it's self respect, self worth, and and those type of things. For yourself, how do you envision your next chapter, whether it's personally or professionally?
So right now, my current goal is to get my CADC, Certified Drug and Alcohol Counselor. I have the CADC educational training completed. I'm currently working on getting my supervision hours. You know, one hurdle that I'm facing with that is my degree. I've kind of dug myself into a financial hole with the government, making it difficult for me to get student loans. So, you know, but that's it. That's something that I'm working on. That is my goal at this moment. I would love to have a private LLC where I can counsel people and work with them in their recovery for a long term. You know, right now at the prison, it's a 8.5 to 12 month program. And, you know, there's issues with that because you get good time for being in the program. And that's kind of why these people are signing up
Yeah. I work in a
with
prison too.
success rates. Okay. Yeah. So with success rates already being extremely low with recovery, right? You add forced treatment, it lowers my effectiveness of being able to help people. I still thoroughly enjoy it and I wouldn't change it. And I understand that even in the CADC position, people are court ordered to go through those things. And that isn't always going to be an issue, but on a much greater or lesser scale than what I currently do.
Man, I'd love to help you with that in any way. I got told all over the state of Texas that I couldn't be a counselor. My degree is actually not in substance abuse counseling; it's in education. So I had to go through a career school. And I know the laws are different between where are you at?
Delaware.
Delaware. Yeah, man, keep fighting for it and don't give up, man. Keep asking crazy questions and being persistent, looking for every option. It's worth it. It is worth it. I love my work in the prison, but I also like the ability to provide services in other ways as well, man. And I see your heart, and I think you have a whole lot to offer. Just in the way that you word things and the insights that you gained in your own process, man. You have a lot to give. One of the questions I have for you now is: you described earlier either sleeping or using drugs to try to escape either the trauma that you experienced or maybe the chaos you were going through then. What does peace look like to you today?
Yeah, so peace or serenity is something that I misunderstood in the past. A lesson that I learned early into my recovery journey was, I would constantly say, like, I'm bored. I'm so bored, right? Like, I need to occupy, I need to do something. And I remember having a conversation with my sponsor that was life altering for me and kind of led me to understand peace and serenity. And he was explaining to me that I was addicted to chaos, right? I grew up in a chaotic household and I carried that through my teen years, my adult years, and it had became my baseline. Um, that feeling of boredom, I had to redefine that, that is peace. That is serenity. Those moments that I get to myself or I get to sit down with my wife or my grandchildren, that is my moment of peace.
Mr. Breeze, man, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you and honor to be able to hear your story. Where can people find you at? Where can they find your clothing?
Yeah. So we have a website, fourthdimensionapparel.com. That's the number 4th Dimension Apparel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram. You can purchase items directly through the shops on those sites as well. We do have a TikTok, but I'm struggling. I'm struggling with the TikTok thing, man. My age is showing with that. But the portion of all sales we donate to the recovery community here in Delaware, and majority of the rest of that money goes back into creating new designs and photo shoots and things like that to kind of spread the message, man. The goal with the company is not to make $1 million or to retire. The goal is truly to spread the message.
Thank you, Mr. Breeze, for being on today. Everyone, please check out his website and thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on, man.